this man needs to get off Twitter. What's up, y'all? Today I am making a very special video, a video that I did not know that I'd be making a follow-up to. Toward the end of last year, I released a video where I discussed books that I absolutely adored but could not recommend for ethical reasons, and that video kind of blew up. I really loved the conversations that we all got to have in the comment section about those books, as well as books that y'all couldn't recommend. And I still do intend on releasing a follow-up video where I talk about the books that y'all as subscribers do not recommend, despite the fact that you really enjoyed them. However, before I released that, I want to talk about some more books that I really enjoyed but cannot recommend for various reasons. This is because after filming that video, I was like, oh, frickin' snap peas, I realized that I forgot a bunch of books, and there is a book that I recently read that I want to be able to discuss and also share why I don't recommend it. So we're gonna have a little bit of a follow-up, and I don't know what the shadows are doing here, but I'm kind of liking it. I'm kind of liking that I'm two-faced over here. You know what I'm saying?
It's giving Harvey Dent.
I'm enjoying it because we are talking about the two sides to enjoying a book, and this video is essentially really about what it means to separate the author from their work, which is not something that I personally do. I know a lot of y'all do, which is your personal choice. But without further ado, let's talk about a bunch of books that I love, that I adore, that impacted me in so many ways, but I don't recommend them per my own ethical code. The first book we're gonna be talking about is Ender's Game. This is by Orson Scott Card. Let me know if you were a part of the book community during the time that Ender's Game became popular. It became popular later after its release, but that was a very special time in science fiction, specifically for those who read and loved that book. I would honestly compare the fan base for Ender's Game to the fan base for Twilight. Fans were deeply, deeply devoted to Ender's Game. It was all we could talk about. We had lengthy discussions about this book on forums and arguments, and it just really was a pop cultural experience that you had to be there for. The experience of reading it and talking about it with other people that enjoyed that book was just so emotional, and I would compare it to the feeling of going to a midnight release at Barnes & Noble back in the day. If you know, you know. What's really sad about that is at some point, all of us who attended those midnight releases attended one for the last time, not knowing that we would never get to have another. What is going on behind me?
Is that an advertisement?
This is supposed to be soothing. Anyway, it just was an awesome time in terms of bonding over a book. It was the first adult science fiction book that I was obsessed with in a very, very long time, and I was riding for Ender and this world that was created. So for those of you who are not in the know, Ender's Game is a very intense, well-written novel about this little boy named Ender who is an underdog, and he is also highly brilliant. Because of his brilliance, he is accepted into this very prestigious academy and trained to fight the buggers. I can't remember their actual term, but basically they are just big aliens in space that resemble insects, and they're trying to end the war. And essentially, because of the plasticity of these children's mind, the military decides to start using children as the frontline soldiers for battling this alien race. Now, there are so many components about the story that I really enjoyed. I loved the academy training component, and that just was believable. Watching Ender be broken down and reassembled and have to find his way in the world and deal with what he's experiencing at this academy. He experiences intense bullying from this character named Ashiel, who is out to kill him, absolutely out to kill him. And Ender, because he is so small, has to use his intellect to outwit and to fight and defend himself at so many times throughout the book. And personally, I really love an underdog main character, especially characters who have to utilize their intellect versus their physical skill and dominance in order to dominate an opponent. I really love a good strategist. And this book is all about strategy. And watching the way these kids bonded and adapted and the way that they were challenged and tested, as well as the action in the book itself. This was not a boring book by any means. All of that just made the book exactly what I wanted. It left such an impact on me, and I loved how philosophical it was. I loved how political it was. I absolutely adored how it emotionally drew me in to the story, and do not get me started on the fucking world building. Now, this is a book that is very technical and math heavy. It is nowhere near as technical and math heavy as some science fiction books. Like, people who read a ton of adult sci-fi probably found this to be fairly readable. But for me, as somebody who doesn't read a whole lot of adult sci-fi, it was challenging in a really good way. It was not confusing, but it was challenging. And
there goes the fucking sun.
There goes the sun, doo-doo-doo-doo. I don't know, she might come back, just like my father, popping in and out of my life. Long story short, it was great. I could rant and rave about this book, honestly, forever. I loved Ender. I loved that he was not only smart, but he had a heart of gold. And that is one of my biggest critiques often for literature, is that you'll have a smart character, but they are just completely devoid of personality, right? They are completely devoid of empathy. And I just love a character that is allowed to be smart and also highly emotionally intelligent, as well as really love his chosen family. The reason that I can't ethically recommend this book is, unfortunately, Orson Scott Card is a notorious homophobe, and it really sucks. I was heartbroken when I found out. I will not be continuing on with the series. There's like 16 books. It's a very big series, and I was so excited to go through them. But A, I was told that the quality of the books goes down the drain, and B, I just don't want to support Orson Scott Card as an author. Next up, we have the most controversial book potentially on this list. I'm pretty sure it is the most controversial book that is on this list, and that is none other than A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. What's funny is I actually started a reading vlog for this book. It was like a little experiment. I wanted to do an experiment where I read this very famous book and chronicled my reactions, and I canceled the video despite the fact that I had a ton of footage, because in order for me to talk about that book in any kind of depth, I would have had to also talk about some very traumatic things that I experienced, and I was not comfortable having to peel those layers back on camera, which is very understandable. So because of that, I scrapped the video. I've had so many of y'all ask me, as a queer and Black person, what are my thoughts on A Little Life? I very conspicuously have been absent from talking about this book and joining in on the discourse surrounding it because of a deeply personal choice that I made. I love all the discourse about this book that goes around, but I just haven't felt comfortable talking about it until now, and I still don't, but I'm going to say what I can. And in order to kind of talk about this, I'm going to read a review from a bookstagrammer that I absolutely adore, whose name is Hunter. So I'm going to read one of Hunter's posts about this book, and that's going to really well kind of summarize my thoughts on A Little Life. But before I read this post from Hunter, I also just want to talk just briefly about the book in case you're not in the know. So essentially, this is the story of a racially ambiguous man named Jude, and we are following him in his history as a child, where he was in the foster system and going through some incredibly traumatic things. And we follow him now as an adult who is disabled as a result of the trauma that he experienced as a child, and struggling to build relationships that are healthy now that he is an adult and a lawyer with a tight-knit circle of friends. And in this circle of friends, he is very private. He's kind of the mysterious elephant in the room, because despite the fact that I think it's 3 other people know and love him deeply, they don't really know him. They don't really know anything about him. And during this story, he is falling in love with one of his best friends, and it is very emotional. It's very intense. It is, I think, around 600 pages long, and I read this book in a hybrid form with audio and the physical, When I first posted about my love for this book on Bookstagram a few years ago, the comments flooded with people saying how much they hated it, how unrealistic they felt the trauma was, how unnecessary, gratuitous, and because I had by this point stitched the very fabric of my identity to this book, I felt like they were talking about me. Was my own sexual abuse unrealistic, too gratuitous? This book felt like permission to allow the entirety of my trauma to exist openly, to be spoken aloud and given space to heal. So the criticism of this book felt personal. I know it wasn't and can separate that now, but I think sometimes we forget how deeply connected people are to books that mirror their experiences and why it can be so painful to see those experiences called into question. I know there are other criticisms and more discussion points, but this is Instagram and there's limited space. But I will say that for me, this one still holds up. I went in mindful of all the criticisms I heard, both valid and questionable, and I think that despite its flaws, it's still a beautiful book, and I'm glad it exists in the world. The reason that this book is so hard for me to talk about is because I think that it simultaneously is and isn't problematic. But hear me out. I think that if you are a queer person who reads this book and is like, I think that this violence is gratuitous, I think that it's exploiting queer trauma, I think that it's trauma porn, etc., etc. I think that you're entitled to feel that way because I can't tell you what is traumatic to you, just like you cannot tell me what is trauma for me, because we all perceive the world differently, and as a result of our own perceptions and our own sense of self, who we actually are, the way that we absorb information, how our heart works, all of those things, certain things are traumatic to other people and aren't to others. For me, one of the reasons that I read so much horror is because through trauma, that is how I work through my own traumatic experiences. So books that are trauma heavy are actually often the most therapeutic for me because it allows me to conceptualize my own experiences. So I would never say that it is like problematic to call this book trauma porn, if that makes sense. I do have very complex feelings about Hanya as an author. I think that her work is in some ways anti-Black. I do not think that this is intentional, but the way that she utilizes her Black characters in her books, I do take issue with. There's not enough time in the world to get into that. There have been a lot of people throughout the years who, have taken issue with the fact that Hanya is writing queer literature as a non-queer person. And I think it's really important that we not be assuming that Hanya is not a part of the queer community herself and just simply not vocal about it, because there has been an issue with forcing authors to come out in order to see their books as valid. And it's a complex issue because on the one hand, you don't want to have straight and cis authors exploiting queer and trans stories for their own personal benefit. But on the other hand, you have to acknowledge that not everybody is out and not everybody has to come out. And that is its own nuanced discussion. Personally, the way that I navigate this, because I do prefer to read my queer books from the source, I tend to and try to only read queer narratives by authors that I know are out, because that is what allows me to be the most comfortable with the experience. Because I do not know if Hanya has ever outright talked about her sexuality, because of that, I am not willing to call this book an exploitation of queerness, if that makes sense. That's my personal choice. Too often I see this issue broken down in a very overly simplistic way that serves absolutely no one. For me, I felt very seen through various parts of this book. Now, all of that being said, right, Hanya has outright said that she set out to write a very traumatic book. I wanted to make the saddest book ever because it is so complex, and also because my experience with this book is so deeply personal. This is why I would never ever recommend the book, because of comments that the author has made, the way that she is known for having written her Black characters, because of the fact that a lot of people have said that this book was very traumatic for them. I mean, Hannah broke down in tears reading this book and was very harmfully affected by this book. So any book, regardless of my experience with it, that has inflicted this amount of damage on people, I'm just simply not comfortable recommending, even if the author, is queer. It's just not a book that I feel the pressure to recommend, especially because in order to recommend it, I would have to talk about and get into themes that just are too damn personal for me. Next up, we have Rage of Dragons by Evan Winters. Out of all of the books on this list, this is the book that I potentially love the least. It's either the bottom slot or second to last. Now this is a fantasy. I think it might have been Evan Winters' debut from a Black author. It is a West African centric fantasy where we are following a young man named Tao who is on a mission to get revenge for his daddy. He sees his daddy cut down right in front of him and is like, hell nah, we're gonna put an end to this. So he goes and becomes a soldier, I believe. I read this like 3 years ago, so details are a little hazy. So he becomes a soldier, goes through the whole training academy. Y'all know I love training shit. I love that shit. I eat it up. Mom.
I don't know why I did that. What the fuck?
He becomes an incredible warrior, and his whole motivation, his whole personality is hinged upon revenge. So just think about Black John Wick, honestly. That's the plot of the book, and then there's dragons. Oh man, I was so disappointed with this book in terms of why I can't ethically recommend it, because despite the fact that I think I gave it 3 stars overall, there are just some things that are so creative and really well done. Like, he gets to go to hell and fight demons, and the demon world building is really cool. The world building itself, the rules for how these demons can be in the world and not, and where the magic comes from, the magic is really creative, very well done. One of the biggest criticisms that I had for this book at the time, my non-ethical criticisms, was the fact that Tao had no character. All this man wanted was revenge. That was literally it. He had a soft spot for basically his high school childhood sweetheart, and he wanted revenge. That was literally it. There's no characterization. But now that I'm a little bit older, a little bit wiser, I have realized that that was probably intentional on Winters' part, because there is no Tao. He has not built an identity that is not related to his quest for revenge, because revenge is everything to him. This makes sense. So now that I'm a little bit older, I am kind of retracting that issue. Basically, this book is the equivalent to what I call man on a mission films. And y'all know exactly the films that I'm talking about. These are franchise films, blockbuster films, where the whole plot is a man getting revenge for someone that was killed. It's usually his wife or his girlfriend, and a bunch of people die as a result, and that's the plot. There's lots of explosions, death, murder. That's basically, so if you love those kind of movies, you will probably love this book. And there's lots that I can say about it. No, hell no. This is racist. You're interrupting Black Joy. Okay. Why are there so many? I mean, get your coin, boo. Get your coin. You know what? Not me talking about ads. I'm a whole YouTuber. I take it back. Get your coin, boo. But long story short, I could rant a lot about, in a good way, good ranting, about how cool the magic is and the world building itself, the costuming. There's a lot that can be said for this book. And the reason that I just can't ethically recommend it flat out is because a woman is raped for shock value, and everything about the way that it was written disgusted me. Oh my god, it just makes me so mad thinking about how this character was treated. Zuri deserved better. I didn't like it, and it's not that there aren't ways that sexual violence can be written in a book that isn't problematic. I'm not saying that it is always problematic to have sexual violence written into a fantasy story. There are plenty of ways that this can be done and with sensitivity and in a way that is not intentionally designed to shock. When you turn the page, the chapter starts with a line about this really beloved character being raped. I just thought that it was absolutely disgusting, and it was also very, like, I had to put it just, it's talking about it, I lose my, I don't even want to talk about it anymore. That's why I can't ethically recommend this book. Next up, we have Landline by Rainbow Rowell. Now, I have a very kind of like whimsical-y experience with this book. It's not my kind of story. Basically, this is a book that is about a struggling couple. They are married and they are just on the verge of divorce. They are ready to ride that horse. Ew, why did that rhyme? Her husband...
Wait, what?
Essentially what happens is one day the wife picks up the phone and it's her husband back when they were falling in love as kids. And so throughout the book, she is on the phone with her husband back, who is back in time while she's in the present. The premise is freaking cool, and they're falling back in love all over again, and in some ways it's a second chance romance. And you guys know that my biggest issue with romance often is, or commercial commercial popular romance is that the couples don't really go through enough in order for me to see them as a believable couple, in order for me to really root for them, because as a person, it just takes me a long time to form romantic attachments. So if I'm going to believe in a romantic attachment in a book, I need to see y'all go through a hell of a lot. And that's why I tend to like romance in horror and thriller books, because we get to see them tested in a way that makes sense to my brain. And so in Landline, you're really excavating this relationship. It was really good. It was really well done. It is Christmassy, and I love to reread certain books at Christmas. That's kind of a tradition that I'm building. So I reread The Polar Express every year. I am trying to reread Nosferatu every year, as well as there's another, The Afterlife of Holly Chase, because these are emotionally charged stories for me that remind me of the first time that I read them, and it just helps me connect with myself a few years prior. Plus, I really love Christmas. If I could move to the North Pole and build toys for a living, I would. But I just don't support Rainbow Rowell as an author. I read Eleanor and Park, I think back in 2013, and I did not see all of the ways that it was incredibly racist towards Asian people. And thankfully it's because of the book community, because of Asian reviewers speaking out about the racism in the book, particularly when it got a movie deal. I don't know if that's still happening, but because of those incredible elucidating reviews, I realized that Rainbow Rowell is just not an author I'm comfortable supporting. I really hope that she has grown as a person, and I'm sure that she has. I like to believe that she has. To my knowledge, I don't think she's ever apologized or owned the very, very racist way that Park was written and that Asian folks were depicted in Eleanor and Park. And so because of that, I'm just not going to read more of her books. And that's why I just have decided to actually no longer reread Landline for Christmas. I really wanted to reread it this year, but I sat with myself and I thought about it, and I was just like, you know what, there are other books on my shelves. I think I had the experience that I had with this book, and I am comfortable leaving that in the past and moving and falling in love with other books in the future, because it is far from the only Christmas romance story that I can believe in. Then we have Misery by Stephen King. I read Misery before I knew about Stephen King and the issues with him as an author. Before I knew, particularly the issue of him loving to write slurs into his books, the F word, the N word, just liberally. I didn't know about that. I also didn't know about the his personal beliefs. Just, this man needs to get off Twitter. Stephen King is hell-bent on destroying his legacy, but he never will, because the legacy is honestly just so much bigger than himself at this point. He is probably the most celebrated horror author of all time, specifically in part because of how many of his books have been adapted into blockbuster films. Correct me if I'm wrong, do y'all think that Stephen King is the most celebrated horror author of all time? Let's maybe say modern horror author. Would love your opinions on that statement that I just made. I read Misery. It was my second Stephen King book that I'd ever read. The first was Full Dark No Stars, an anthology. I read that I think in 2014. I loved it. I really, really enjoyed it. And you may or may not know that Misery is a very famous story about a man named Paul, who's a writer, who is kidnapped after he crashes his car in a snowstorm by Annie, who is his biggest fan. And Annie basically ties him to her bed in order to nurse him back to health, and forces him to rewrite the ending of this series where he kills off her favorite character. And the character's name is Misery. And this is about what he goes through while chained to this woman's bed. And I love the claustrophobia of the horror. I love that the book took place in one room, in a bed no less. And Stephen King managed not to make it boring, despite the fact that it was like 500 pages. I found that very impressive. I loved it. It was full of psychological terror. It had great action scenes in it. It was a really good book. But you will just never, flat out, never, never, never see me recommend a Stephen King book. There are only 2 books by him that I'm going to read, and then I'm going to be done with him forever and ever and ever. You'll never see me pick up another Stephen King book ever again. And those 2 books are The Shining and Dr. Sleep. The reason that I am hell-bent on reading those books is because I had a very spiritual experience with Dr. Sleep, but I just want to read them just to know how they compare to the movies, because it is through the movies that I have formed this connection. And after that, I just have no interest in him. Oh, I take it back. I want to read Pet Sematary. I take it back. I just really want to read that book. But after I read those books, even if they become my favorite books of all time, you will never see me recommend them, simply because I'm not out here trying to put money in this man's pocket. And there are plenty of horror authors who are incredible, who are writing those same kinds of gripping stories that are not Stephen King. Now, the last book, you guys, this last book, I am so pissed off. I'm so pissed. I'm so pissed. I'm pissed because I started this book fully expecting not to care about it. I started it on audio just to, you know how sometimes you kind of pick an audiobook to throw on when you're driving or washing the dishes, a book that you're interested in but just not super invested in, a book that you kind of just want to say that you've read, per se. And I always pay attention to my audiobooks. I always keep track of what's going on in the story, but with my physical books, I'm very careful about the physical books that I select. I select them meticulously. With my audiobooks, I'm more likely to just kind of try a book on a whim. That's what I mean. Not again. Hate you and all that you stand for. This is an audiobook. It was available on Scribd. I have a membership and I tried it on a whim simply because I loved the movie growing up. I went into this book knowing the plot twist for Shutter Island and knowing the plot itself for Shutter Island, and knowing that this was a book that I probably wouldn't be recommending because of those things. Now, before I get into all that, I'm gonna tell you real quick what it's about. This book is set, I forget the era, I think it's 1950s, maybe 1960s. And we are following Teddy, who is an ex-soldier that is currently a marshal.
I don't know what the fuck a marshal is.
I read the book and I still don't know what a marshal is.
Teddy picks up an assignment where he must go to Shutter Island, an infamous psychiatric facility known for having the most violent patients in the country. And he is summoned to this institution because one of the patients vanished from her room. The room was locked. The windows were shut. She had no shoes. She evaporated into thin air, and he's trying to find out what happened. But when he gets there, he starts to notice that things are afoot. Things are amiss. And that now that he is there, he may just become an inmate himself. I'm very sensitive about books that I recommend that have psychiatric institution depiction. And this is because the depiction of psychiatric facilities is often ridiculous. Not only incorrect, but used in a way that is stigmatizing to folks that are mentally ill, as well as folks who live with psychiatric illness are already used as plot devices for shock value and dehumanized in so many ways through literature as well as film and TV. So I did not want to add to that, especially as somebody who has been hospitalized, especially as somebody who does live with co-occurring mental illness. So I'm very careful about what books I recommend that have psychological care depiction in them. So that is one of the reasons why just flat out I wouldn't recommend this book, because psychiatric horror is just something I'm a bit sensitive about it. But let's talk about the reasons that I love this book before I talk about all of the reasons why I would not recommend this book. Even knowing the plot twist, it was still incredible. It just was incredible. And again, this kind of plot twist I recognize is problematic. Now, I have a complex relationship with psychiatric horror. Y'all know me, and y'all already know that I cope with things that impact me by seeing them depicted. A lot of times I actually really empathize and relate to representation in movies of issues of psychiatry that are actually problematic, but privately I do relate to them, while I still acknowledge cerebrally and cognitively that that experience that I have is not the experience of the broader community. I need to be mindful and respectful of that. Teddy's particular struggle I related to. It's really hard to explain, and again, I don't want to be forced to out myself and talk about my mental illnesses, but I'm just saying, even though I often relate to these kinds of stories, I don't recommend them because of how harmful they are. If I hadn't known the plot twist already going in, I think I probably would have died. The audiobook was phenomenal. The narrator was an incredible choice, and the atmosphere of it was excellent. But one of the things that I did not expect going into this book was how painstakingly it wrote about grief and love and longing. Teddy loves his wife with the passion of 1,000 warriors, and you really fall in love with their love throughout the book. The things that he says about his wife, about grieving her and loving and adoring her, man, they hit me so hard. The quotations in this book were phenomenal. I was not prepared for how emotional and well crafted this book was. Some of my most favorite and treasured quotes of all time have come from this book. And I only read it a few months ago, maybe 2 months ago. And it was the kind of book where I was constantly rewinding it so I could hear the narrator perform those quotes all over again. And I wrote these quotes down in my journal. I wrote them over and over and over. It really profoundly stuck with me. But the reason that I'm not gonna recommend this book is because the author liked to use the N-word a little too liberally. End it all.
Okay, great, sorry.
There's a snowblower going outside. I do not give a flying fuckity fuck about, this is always the excuse that people make in my comment section when I talk about how I don't support white authors writing the N-word. They'll be like, oh, well, it was for historical accuracy.
Oh, they're bringing awareness.
Oh, they're making money. They're making coin. And flat out, for whatever reason, I'm never, ever, ever going to support a white author making money off of using the N-word in any capacity. So you can just delete that comment right there, because I will never get behind it. The fact that you are profiting even indirectly from having the N-word in your book is not okay with me personally. It never will be for any freaking reason. I don't care if you're trying to show how racist a character is and by proxy how wrong that racism is. You can do that without having to use that word in your text. And if you can't do it,
maybe you shouldn't be writing books.
Okay, if you can create this really intense creative world, but you can't figure out how to talk about racism without using the N-word, it's just giving thank you next author for me. Another thing that really pissed me off about it was a big component of the book was about medical experimentation, and yet there was absolutely no mention of the history of experimentation on Black people, specifically African slaves, in this book. The way that experimentation in America was talked about, it was literally as if that started with Shutter Island, and it really irritated me. All of that history of experimenting, not just on Black folk, but people of color, has already been happening in America for centuries. They talked so much about various types of experimenting that happened not just in America, but in Germany and in other places. So the author clearly knows history of people being experimented on, and I just didn't like it. Also, we have to talk about the orderlies. The depiction of the orderlies was concerning. Now, a lot of white reviewers are going to say,
well, you know, it was historically accurate. It was the 50s, of course, they talked like that.
It still just made me really uncomfortable. The narrator had this very, very, very exaggerated Black man accent that I just personally didn't care for. And again, he's just performing, and I get it. It doesn't change the fact that it made me uncomfortable. And it goes further than how these men talked. It was also how they acted, how they interacted with each other. And again, people are going to say accuracy, 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 but to me it felt like stereotypicalness. And it just also felt very, very freaking unnecessary. It just was a shit show. It was a hot mess in terms of racism.
Are you kidding me?
I can't. It was a hot mess in terms of racism. That paired with the fact that I know that this kind of representation of mental illness in psychiatric facilities is just harmful. Whether you relate to it like I do or not, it does not serve the broader community. Whether I relate to it or not, whether I'm able to get something out of it or not, I'm still not going to recommend it because I understand that my experience is incongruent. I was not expecting to love Shutter Island so much. I probably will listen to it again this year. I'm not gonna lie, I really, really enjoyed that book, but you will never see me recommend it, and I will not be talking about it from here on out. But these were the recent books that I have had issues with. Definitely check out part 1 of that video if you missed it and want to hear me talk more about books that I love but can't ethically recommend. There's a really good discussion, and I'm still going to be producing that video talking about books y'all don't recommend. So if you have any anti-recommendations, please leave them in the comment section down below. I'm gonna wrap up this video, but before I do, I want to talk about what we're doing on my Patreon this month in case you are interested in joining. Our buddy read is going to be tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, and our sprint guest host will be Chloe. We will be doing a couple fantastic reading sprints with her, and I will be filming a spoiler-filled vlog about this book. The Patreon dedicated video for this month is going to be a try a chapter tag, which I'm really geeked for. If you want more content from me, you can check me out on Instagram. I post over there pretty frequently. I also have a non-binary book club club. That is the bee's knees, and the non-binary book club pick for this month is All the White Spaces by Ali Wilkes, which is one of my favorite horror books of all time. It has a trans main character and they are set in the Arctic wilderness while being hunted by something paranormal and immensely powerful. Gabby of Gabby Reads is going to be our guest host, so I cannot freaking wait for that. And then this Sunday is going to be the live show for our December book, which was The Sunbearer Trials, and Nat of Something Bookish This Way Comes will be our guest host. So information and details down below. I want to see some anti-book recommendations in the comment section down below. I'm going to come for you and all of your pets. Love you, be safe, be good to yourselves, be good to others, and I cannot wait to see you in my next video.